So with respect to those drugs that are currently available, the anti-CD38 antibodies still have a very big role, and there have been multiple trials performed with different partners, such as with proteasome inhibitors and immunomodulatory drugs, but particularly with pomalidomide. And the reason for mentioning them first is that many patients are now becoming refractory to lenalidomide, and so these types of combinations with anti-CD38 antibodies certainly have a role. I guess the current developments in terms of using many of the powerful drugs in first and early lines is that many patients are now becoming refractory to anti-CD38 antibody relatively early. And to that extent, there are combinations such as carfilzomib and pomalidomide, but also new drugs such as the antibody-drug, the BCMA antibody-drug conjugates, which will hopefully provide an additional option for people who are already refractory to anti-CD38, as well as the new cereblon E3 ligase ubiquitin modulators, or CELMoDs, which are basically the derivatives, shall we say, of the IMiDs, which are currently in clinical trials. So the hope is that they will also play a role in patients who are becoming more and more refractory. Yeah, the first thing to say is that in patients who are very refractory, if possible, we would try to use T-cell redirected therapies. And the reasons that they may not be eligible, the first important and probably most prevalent reason is access. However, there are patient factors as well. For instance, there are some patients whose performance status is not good enough really for them to sustain the toxicities of T-cell redirected therapies. And it's also important to know that it is also a patient preference. Sometimes they do not wish to run the risk of the significant side effects of T-cell redirected therapy. So those are many of the factors which help us to make the decision with the patient for non-T-cell redirected therapies. Yeah, I think the most prevalent side effect is cytopenias, and in relation to that, infections. And it's got to be said that while the T-cell redirected therapies have a high rate of infections, in particular the bispecifics, as well as CAR-T, but we tend to kind of pay attention more to the rate in bispecifics. But for non-T-cell directed therapies, the later the line of relapse it is, the more susceptible they are to infection. And therefore, we obviously monitor them very closely. We use prophylactic antiviral as well as prophylaxis against pneumocystis. And we also try our best to ensure that their white blood cells are supported. So I guess my main message is that while infections may not be as up in the concerns, because of the concerns in T-cell redirected therapies, they are as much a worry for non-T-cell therapies. There are some kind of more unique side effects, in particular with the BCMA antibody-drug conjugate belantamab, which affects patients' eyes. But it is important to be aware that if one does choose to use that in the future, as in the clinical trial, it's very important to monitor their visual acuity with particular indexes for keratopathy, and to make appropriate dose reductions, as well as increasing the interval between doses. And certainly the clinical trials have shown that the side effects can be mitigated by these measures. So in terms of issue of transplantation, I might first address that because obviously autologous transplant remains a standard of care in transplant-eligible patients at first line. So, for instance, there was quite a lot of discussion about whether salvage transplants should be used. Now, I would put it to you that in my opinion, where in jurisdictions where there are there's reasonable access to the new therapies, we are doing less and less salvage transplants because one of the concerns is the fact that the use of melphalan together with lenalidomide maintenance can increase the chances of second malignancy. And while that percentage is not high, if you have other options, it is appropriate to try to overcome that and avoid that risk. In terms of sequencing, I think it would be fair to say that most of the sequencing is predicated upon the availability of drugs, but given that most jurisdictions have daratumumab for non-transplant eligible patients, and that is often used in conjunction with lenalidomide, and lenalidomide is now used very commonly in, until progression, disease progression. So the majority of patients after their first line are already lenalidomide refractory and maybe anti-CD38 and refractory. So the sequencing would be that if a patient is len refractory but not anti-CD38 refractory, and there's access to anti-CD38, we would certainly use that in combination in the second line. However, if that is not available, then other combinations such as carfilzomib pomalidomide can be used. And overall, I think the maxim is that because of the attrition of patients with each successive line, one basically has to use the most powerful therapy at each line.